one of the things the government seems to be banking its hopes on is a very sharp V-shaped recovery. A V-shaped recovery means you go down, you come up, and you come up really sharp. Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, do you buy this contention that we won't have a slow recovery, we won't have a double dip, there won't be a W, instead there'll be a sharp recovery? What's your understanding?
Well, I don't think we have enough information to judge whether it will be a sharp recovery. Let me say that, the first thing to know is, when is the lockdown going to be completely removed? I mean, for example, we're beginning to relax it. We have to relax it also in the red zones. If we relax it in the red zones and the infection rate goes up, are we going to reintroduce the lockdown, or are we going to allow the infection rate to be higher? That depends on whether we've done enough work to make sure that the health infrastructure can deal with the infection. We don't know how much success we have had in that. So frankly, I would hope that it's a V-shaped recovery. I wouldn't rule that out, because if the virulence of the virus goes down, if the summer heat reduces its ability to transmit, then we could have a much quicker return to normalcy. But equally, the epidemiologists say that that can't be assured. And it's quite possible that it goes down and comes back again. So these are areas of uncertainty. And unless we have a clear judgment, and that has to be an expert judgment, it's very difficult to tell whether you're going to have a V-shaped recovery. One thing is very clear. In the first quarter, you're going to have a large negative GDP growth. When I say negative, I mean substantial. Because for 60% of the areas dealing with 60%
do you have an
of the
estimate,
GDP
sir?
are total luck.
Do you have an estimate for how bad could it get in the first quarter of this year?
I don't have a quarter by quarter estimate, but my own view is that we would be well advised to, as it were, hope for the best and plan for the worst. And planning for the worst, in my view, implies accepting either 0% growth of GDP for the current year, or even a marginally negative up to, say, 2%. Some people are going much beyond that. I know that the IMF has said 1.9, but the IMF calls that a very optimistic outcome. I mean, that's the upper end of the outcome from their point of view. It's not the base outcome. And they have other outcomes that are much more negative for the world, and they haven't translated what that means for India. So we should plan on at least 0%. Now, if you want to make a credible projection of your own macroeconomic strategy to the rating agencies, to the rest of the world, you should make it clear, how are you going to handle a situation when there is 0% growth in GDP, when the budget was based on the assumption of 7% growth in real terms and 10% growth in nominal terms. Now, obviously, what's going to happen is a big reduction in the revenues that come in. It's also true, even if the COVID thing comes to an end, I don't think the climate for disinvestment will recover very quickly. So you won't get what you were hoping to get on disinvestment revenues, and you will be spending more on support for the poor, plus something on health. Now, all of this put together easily accounts for a deterioration in the central government GDP of something of the order of 3+ percentage points. This means that the central government's fiscal deficit will become 6% or a little more. You've got the same problem on the state side, because the states will have a loss of revenues of somewhere between 2 and 3% of their GDP. They will have to make up for some of this by borrowing. I don't think they have much scope for cutting expenditure. They typically tend to delay salaries, etc., but they'll do some of that. But if you allow for the states also to borrow, then the macroeconomic situation of the central government, or the India macroeconomic situation, has to be a deterioration in the general government fiscal deficit of something of the order of 5 to 6% of GDP.
What's the quantum of the stimulus that India can afford? How do you think India should finance that stimulus? Which are the sectors do you think India should be focusing on?
Well, let me explain. To call this stimulus is wrong, because most of this is simply maintaining your expenditure while revenues go down. That's not the same thing as a stimulus. Usually a stimulus is what you do extra in terms of expenditure. So the question arises, can India afford an additional fiscal deficit of, let's say, 6% of GDP, or let's say 5% of GDP, taking the center and the states together. Now, all that this does is it raises the debt to GDP ratio by about 5 percentage points starting next year. Now, my view would be that we should lay out a macroeconomic strategy which, first of all, recognizes this. One of the problems at the moment is we have no official indication of what the fiscal deficit is going to be in the current year. So you can't judge what the government is planning to do without knowing what the fiscal deficit is. I think that should be made very clear. You can have one or two scenarios, but you should be operating in that area, so you lay out your cards on the table. The second is that if you recognize this, then your credibility in world markets, and that is important. I don't think we should just say fiscal deficits don't matter. The credibility depends on your laying out a strategy for bringing the fiscal deficit down next year. And we're not going to have such a huge fiscal deficit next year. So that requires a very credible statement on what's going to happen to expenditure, but most of all, it requires a very credible statement of what you're going to do on tax revenues. Because, the biggest weakness at the moment in India is that our tax revenues are about 5 to 6 percentage points below what is regarded as our taxable capacity. How do we bring this about? How do we correct this? Not, in my view, by jacking up tax rates, not by bringing in sudden new taxes. I think we need to recognize that the time has come for serious tax reform, both on direct taxes and on indirect taxes. And we should, that includes,
what kind of reforms?
GST.
How should the government be generating revenues? There was one paper that went viral, created a lot of consternation, then the government withdrew it about raising taxes above 40%. Yes. How do you think the government, how would you handle this question?
By the way, I think that sort of going viral, you should expect. This was a bunch of Indian Revenue Service officers giving their views. It was not a government committee. Sure. It was not the finance ministry. I think you do that by setting up a truly expert committee with absolutely star people on top of it. And they come out with a report for the next budget on what are the most important tax reforms. Now, I would urge this should not be done within the Revenue Department, because after all, they are running an existing system. If you need to think afresh, for example, take the GST. If the GST needs to be basically restructured, which I think it does, you're not going to get it by referring it to the same bunch of officials who've been running the existing system. In 1991, when we had an economic crisis, the government declared the need for tax reforms and set up a committee under Raja Chelliah, an internationally renowned expert, the most distinguished fiscal economist in the country, with lots of representatives from other sectors. They came up with a report within about 3 months or so. That report was widely discussed, and it became the intellectual basis of tax reform for the next 4 or 5 years. That's what we need to do now. And I think what it would do is it would, instead of people saying, oh, India is in a mess, people would start saying, look, India wants to get out of this mess, and here are the recommendations they're considering. And that would enable people to judge whether we are serious about tax reform. Now, let's be clear about it. You can chip and chop with expenditure here and there. But without doing the tax reforms that generate these resources, I don't think you're going to solve the fiscal problem. And you can't do the tax reform in a knee-jerk manner with odd people suddenly coming up with some idea or the other. And I think that is a very, very major challenge. That's one point. Second, I think we have to recognize that both our large and our medium industry. Now, I recall the chief economic advisor said that they're going to have some package for medium and small. He didn't say what it was, but hopefully we'll see it soon. I think we need something both for large and medium, because remember, if the large industry is stuck, they're the ones that make payments to the small and medium, and they're the ones that generate demand for the small and medium. So unless the large industry gets out of its mess, the small and medium will not be able to take off. What do you do? Well, initially you do some restructuring of the existing debt. I think that the Reserve Bank has done, what they call regulatory forbearance. They're allowing them to delay payment of loans and this and that, introducing moratorium and so on. But more than that, that just takes care of managing the existing loans. These companies now have to look ahead and plan for a better future. That requires capital, and it's wrong to call that liquidity. I mean, they need support. Ideally, they need a lot of equity support, but they're not going to get it right now. So you're going to have to give them credit. Liquidity is a precondition for expanding credit. Banks have enough liquidity. The RBI has done a very good job of pumping liquidity in the system. But the RBI itself says that the banks are not willing to lend. Now, the reason the banks are not willing to lend is in the present circumstances, they're not sure that they're going to get their money back. They're not sure, for example, whether some of these businesses are solvent. I mean, after all, businesses that have relied on, let's say, the hospitality sector, which relies on large gatherings, etc., will be in a different mode in the coming months simply because we're not going to have large gatherings. So different sectors face different problems, but you need to be able to create a window where banks will lend. Now, how do you do that? Well, I think you come very clean by saying one of two things can be done. One is you introduce a government credit guarantee. That is, the banks give the loan and the government offers a guarantee of 25% or 30% or whatever it is of the loan as a first loss. So the government takes the risk. Now remember, individual bankers do not know what else you're doing in the economy. The government is the one that knows what else we're doing. The government is the one that knows how the economy is going to recover. So when it's faced with a difficult situation, it makes sense for the government to take that risk. Now, another way of doing the same thing is what the US has done. They have set up what they call, for example, SPVs, special purpose vehicles. Now, the Main Street financing facility is one such special purpose vehicle where the Treasury has invested a small amount of equity. The facility gets a lot of money on loan from the Federal Reserve.
Okay.
And this facility buys up bank loans which are extended to eligible companies. Now, eligible companies are defined somehow as the companies that you want to help. Now, what this does is that in the US, the facility buys up 95% of the loan, leaving only 5% with the bank. This gives the bankers a sense of sharing and partnership. Something like that needs to be done to restore a credit culture.
I am completely out of time, but the problems with the economy are so many that we could go on for another hour and you'd still be coming up with ideas on what should be done. But hearing you over the past half hour just shows me and our viewers what we've been missing for very long. So I hope we can keep getting you back for more such conversations. It's always interesting to hear from you. You heard in the first part the government's point of view on what the challenges are. Then you heard a very different perspective on what can be done to deal with those same challenges. Former Deputy Chairperson of the Planning Commission, one of India's top economists, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, for joining us on this edition of Jumpstart. Thank you, sir.